I'm Josh Middleton. I play guitar in Architects and Sylosis. I'm also a producer and mix engineer, and we're in my studio here in the UK. So I first started playing guitar when I was about 9 or 10, and I was just turned on to music by my dad, just obsessive music fan, and just kind of had lessons instantly and got really sucked into just like focusing on being guitar, and I knew that that was something that I wanted to do for the rest of my life. The band that I first started was Sylosis when we were kids, when we were about 14, and then, you know, hacked away at just the local scene until we ended up getting signed and did a lot more touring nationally and then internationally. Meanwhile, I'd become friends with the Architects guys, and we'd like hung out a lot, and they'd come stay at my parents' house when they were recording in Reading and that kind of thing. So as Sylosis was always going, I was already friends with those guys, and then when I joined the band in 2017, I kind of been doing double duty in both bands since then. The music that influenced me when I started playing guitar was just a lot of metal stuff, and that's really still my focus, is just heavy music. But for me, yeah, it was always bands like Metallica, Pantera, Slayer, Sepultura in the mid to late 90s. All that kind of stuff's what really got me excited about metal as a kid. I got into music production out of necessity, just because being a young band, at the time there wasn't many metal producers or any metal producers locally, and studio time was expensive and we were just kids without jobs, so I just kind of got into recording. I started with a 4-track and then eventually got a home computer set up. And I was always a fan of certain producers. I used to see a few names pop up on all the albums that I thought sounded the best when I was a kid, and then it got to a point where I'd sometimes buy albums even if those guys had mixed or produced a record, just to enjoy the production. So music production and tones, something that I've been nerding out on kind of as soon as I really got into playing guitar properly. Some of my best musical memories, I think most recently, is coming back with Sylosis after a hiatus. We'd kind of had 5 years off, and to finally come back and play a show again and dust off some of those riffs was a big moment for me. It was a lot of fun. And also just that feeling of finishing like our first record was a big moment, just like knowing that we got to the point where we'd signed to like a big metal label and we'd spent so much time on this record, and that's kind of just like a bit of a milestone. But just that achievement of being like, okay, we've got like a record out, and we've got we can start to sort of put our own stamp on the metal scene.
We're just a bunch of fucking animals.
So my process of getting my guitar tones involves kind of, I'll have an idea in my head of what sort of tone I'm after, and I'll instantly kind of know what head and stomp box and cab to reach for. But the main thing that I really hone in on is the mic placement. So picking the right speaker in the right cabinet, but just getting the mic placement right is something that, if you can nail that, you're just saving yourself so much work in the mix and saving yourself using too much EQ, which can just start to sound weird. So if you can get a guitar tone that sounds perfect at the source, that's the focus. You want to essentially try and get a guitar tone that doesn't need any EQ. And that, sometimes it happens, but it's not that common. But if that's what you're focusing for, that you know that you're not just relying on EQ as a crutch later down the line. So really nailing the mic placement is the most important thing for me, and having a Dynamount, which is a robotic mic stand, really helps. So I think a signature part of my guitar tone is just aiming for something that's just really balanced. I think, you know, if you go too much either way, you might run into troubles down the line. And I think just having a tone that is really balanced, but also really upfront in the mix and really clear. And something that I always try and avoid is having what I call cab artifacts in a mix. Just sometimes if you're a bit too off to the side, you can get this kind of sound that is just all I hear over the top of the guitar tone. So having something that sounds really direct without being too fizzy, but still has the low end. So for me, it's all about the balance, and you know, then you can kind of sculpt it quite easily in the mix to whatever the mix needs. So what I'm looking for in a good guitar tone, I know a lot of producers and mix engineers will kind of say to use your ears, but I'm so used to seeing a frequency analyzer that I kind of know what I'm looking for. I know that, you know, usually my low end and my high end are kind of peaking at a similar point, which I know means that I'm in a balanced kind of area. And getting just a good solid and linear mid-range represented. And if you've got a good mid-range in there, it's really easy to kind of sculpt that if you need, in whatever way that might be in the mix. In the mix, I think I just really want to hear the guitars as loud as I can. I mean, there's always a battle between really loud, punchy modern drums and guitars being really loud, and then the drums may be suffering. So finding a balance is quite hard. So for me, making sure the guitars are as direct sounding as possible is really what I'm after. Obviously, if you plug an amp directly into your desk, it doesn't sound great, so you do need to mic up a cab and get the right mic placement. But part of the reason I've only used top speakers in cabinets is that I've found that if you mic up those speakers on an angled cab, you get a bit of more of a direct sound. So the directness in terms of what you perceive as to be a louder guitar tone is great, because the less cab artifacts or sounds in your guitar tone that don't need to be there, the louder you can push your guitars in the mix, or at least the perceived volume. So what people can expect from this plugin is a lot of attention to detail. The focus mainly is on heavy guitar tones and getting a really solid metal tone. There's a few heads and a few different cabs that I've done all the kind of guesswork and the tone seeking myself to find the speaker combinations I like, the mic positions, the fact that I really like using top speakers in cabinets. There's a lot of options, but I've also tried to reduce some of the option paralysis by taking out some of the stuff that I know isn't as useful and just really focusing on the stuff that is going to get really good, solid guitar tones. So the process of creating this plugin with STL was shipping off my amps and pedals to Italy and then getting sent back a perfect sort of digital replication of those amps. And with regards to the cabs, I used their STL software to capture thousands and thousands of different impulse responses and different microphone placements, just capturing every kind of angle and mic position on the cabinets. So there are a few things I was quite specific about, really nailing. One of the things that was quite tricky to get right was the octave pedal. So that's something that we went back and forth with to make sure that it tracked really well and still sounded nice and smooth and didn't just have that sort of artifacty kind of sound to it. The other thing was adding quite an in-depth EQ at the end of the chain, which I didn't really want to be too overwhelming to some users, but I think I really wanted to be able to include what I would consider mix-ready tones in the plugin, can make some of the moves that I normally do and just remove, you know, certain frequencies that kind of build up here and there just naturally within, you know, miking up a cabinet, that sort of thing. And that's something that I was just, really adamant to kind of nail, and we went back a few times and I'm really happy with what we've got. I think the main focal point for me with this plugin is the cabs. I think it's kind of like the second half of a guitar chain is the most impactful on how it's going to end up sounding in your mix, and it's not as exciting as a guitarist to get into speakers, microphone placement and that sort of thing. It's a lot more fun to play with amps and pedals. But really, if you switch out an amp on a good sounding cab, it doesn't make that much difference. But if you switch out a great amp with a great cab and then switch it to a not so great cab, it makes a huge difference. So I've kind of cherry picked select speakers for the cabs and put them in the top speakers positions, which I feel gets more of a direct tone. So I've brought up loads of different cabs over the last few years to kind of settle on a few that were just the ones that sound great. So there's two different oversized Mesa Boogie cabs, one with speakers from the year 2000, one with speakers from the year 2001. They have vastly different sounding tones. The 2001 speakers are a lot darker and they work really well with the dual rectifier. And with the third cab, it's a British cab. It's a Marshall 1960B, and this one has a Vintage 30 in the top and an EVH G12 speaker. These have a different voicing because obviously it's different cabinet, different construction, but obviously these are 16 ohm versus 8 ohm on the other cabinets. So they're a little bit brighter, but still really, really usable for heavy tones. So I use a device called a Dynamount when I'm getting my guitar tones, which is a robotic mic stand that allows you to kind of really move around and go back to mic placements that you found are good and kind of fine tune exactly what you like out of the speaker and get the right mic placement nailed. And this is what is used when we're capturing the impulse responses. So there's a program that the guys at STL created that just allows the Dynamount to move in every possible direction that it can to capture thousands of impulse responses on just a single speaker. And that was done with 4 different microphones on 6 different speakers. So there are thousands of impulse responses that we've captured. So in terms of choosing the amps for the plugin, I mean, it covers everything that I do. There's a 5150 block letter, which is kind of the holy grail for me. It's an American high gain amp. It's kind of the industry standard for getting a good solid metal guitar tone or rock guitar tone. It's an absolute workhorse and just kind of sounds great no matter what you do with it. It does have a distinct sound to it. It's got a much more notey mid-range around like the 450 area. It's got a lot more body to it. The 5150 has kind of been my go-to amp for a long time now. I know there's a lot of talk about those amps and people kind of like to bicker about is there a difference or not, but having had various iterations of 5150s over the years and 6505s, everyone I know that has a block letter kind of, they share this similar kind of low end, low mid-range characteristic, which is great. The unsung hero for me is the PV-XXX, which is an amp that I've loved and backed for a long time, and it's what I think is the underdog of the metal guitar tone world, which is actually the first amp that I ever got, the first valve amp I got as a kid. It's got a very linear, smooth and complete mid-range to it, which is great. It's 3 channels. It's got an active EQ, which is kind of different for these sorts of amps. So in the neutral point, you're at 0, and then you can cut or boost, I think about 12 dB either side, which is a bit unique for that one. The clean channel is something that I think is really great about this amp. It's just crystal clear, clean tones. Works really well with a compressor in front of it, and it's a clean tone that I've used on a lot of records in the past. I know that a lot of country guys were using that for their clean tone for a while, so don't get put off by the fact that these are all kind of, you know, metal amps. They do cleans really well too. And then lastly, there's a Mesa Boogie Dual Rectifier, which is another industry standard for high gain tones. Very versatile, 3 channels, got a really good clean channel again, really crystal clear. It's something that I use all the time for my cleans. With regards to the dirty sounds, it takes a little bit more to tighten up this amp in terms of your front end attack. So it works really well with the Tempest pedal, where you can just reduce a bit more of the low end going into the front end of the amp. And it also works really well as a blending amp, blended in with either amp number 1 or 2 as kind of like a good thick low end to accompany if you're doing like quad tracking. The pedals that are in the stomp section are kind of my go-to pedals that I use all the time. So the first one is a compressor, which I only really use on clean tones, but it is kind of on every clean tone I ever use. I always use a compressor. I really like the sound of a compressed clean sound. Then it's followed by an octave pedal, which is something that I use a lot more these days on like single note riffs, usually an octave below blended in. Just kind of gives riffs like a kind of distinctive kind of synthy character, and that's used a bit more in Architects, where I'm using it sort of most of the time now in a lot of the riffs. And then the last 2 pedals in the stomp section are The first one is based on the Tempest pedal, which is a signature pedal with 14, which is like your classic kind of boost. It's got a level and a gain, but the unique point on this one is that it's got a low and high pass filter, so you can really get into controlling the low end of certain amps that need a bit more of a cut and that kind of thing. And the way we've done it is that when you bring both the control knobs into the center, it's kind of like doing this on an EQ with your low and high pass. So it might be a bit of a confusing thing for some people that the low and high pass are reducing as both knobs turn in, but just think of it as like an EQ when you can see the tone going in like that. And then the last pedal is based off a Maxon OD808, which is kind of the go-to for a lot of people, and myself included, for just getting a really good metal guitar tone. In terms of the effects module, the focus for me was getting a really good EQ at the end that I could kind of replicate some of the moves that I make in the box when I'm mixing. So it's a very in-depth EQ with a lot of different cues that you can adjust. I like to kind of hone in on frequencies that kind of might be a bit interfering and kind of notch them out. You'll be surprised that if you just take one notch and just in the right place, that it can transform a guitar tone. And the EQ is something that I was really adamant in getting a lot of options in terms of controlling different peaks. So I can include presets that are quite in depth, and I can make a lot of my EQ moves, which I think are quite integral, that I use in both Sylosis and Architects, and replicate tones that I've used on records and include them as presets as well. And also there's a great delay and a reverb. These are sort of sounds that I kind of use more for cleans. So a combination of using the compressor at the front end and then a nice delay and a reverb at the end is kind of a go-to chain for me for my cleans. And obviously having a good delay and reverb is kind of crucial for getting nice lead tones in the mix. So the presets that I'm including, I really don't have different sounds for either band. And even with regards to tuning differently, I still kind of look for a similar thing when I'm setting up guitar tones. So both Architects and Sylosis guitar tones at the source are very, very similar. And just nailing really good, clear sounding guitar tones is something that I'm always striving to do. So I think there's something in here for everyone that is just after a good guitar tone. So the difference between this plugin and my Tone Hub pack is that the Tone Hub pack is obviously just sort of captures of specific tones set up as they are. And with the plugin, it's my amps, cabinets, modeled from the ground up with the ability to adjust all the settings in every aspect of the rig in a way that will translate to how the real amp or the real pedal or cabinet would respond when you're miking them up. So the scope of detail is a lot higher. My favourite feature of the plugin is just the ability to recall presets just really quickly. Various amp cabinet combinations, and most importantly just the EQ moves that, if I'm demoing or just working on a mix, I can just open a preset and it's just got a tone that's just perfect out of the box. In terms of how the plugin compares to the real thing, it's spot on, it's amazing. I've done tests where I've used the real amp with a low box and just switch between the plug-in version and the real amp, and it just nails it. It's really impressive. Same with the cabs. I'm really happy with how the plugin turned out. I think the level of detail on every step of the way has just been perfect. Every single component has been nailed, and I really appreciate the amount of time that's gone in to creating this on both ends. And now just having everything in the plugin is just so great for me. It just saves me a lot of time setting all this stuff up. I know that all my stuff is now perfectly replicated in the plugin form. I think people will like this suite because they'll get a really good insight into what goes into my guitar tones at every step of the way. There's a huge array of different tones to be found within it, and people that don't necessarily know who I am or aren't fans of the bands that I'm in will still get a lot from this, because all of the gear that's gone into it is some of the best out there for getting heavy tones. So if you're looking to get a good metal or rock or any subgenre of metal guitar tone, it's definitely worth checking this plugin out because the attention to detail is all there.